Numbers over time start to become meaningless, and the massive death toll after 1 year of war in Ukraine. Novelist and veteran Elliot Ackerman, an estimate, suggested that Russians and Ukrainians have lost over 100,000 people. The war in Ukraine was supposed to be over by now, and 1 year later it still rages on with no end in sight. Now, the Russian military was supposed to be a near unbeatable war machine. Modernized with petrodollars, it was supposed to easily rout a much smaller force. Now, the war in Ukraine would expose the Russian military as being poorly led, hollow, and brittle, and largely incapable of engaging in any type of the combined arms operations that were required too quickly to take the Ukrainian capital and other key regions of the country and then hold them back. Um, Ukraine's leaders mobilized their entire population to resist the Russian invaders. The Ukrainian military, expertly led and trained to fight like a nimble, modern Western army, traded space for time. The Russians quickly lost momentum as the Ukrainians counterattacked their flank and rear and other vulnerable areas. The Russians were forced to pull back and consolidate their forces in order to preserve what remained of their invading army, which has now seen many of its elite and other frontline units decimated. Now, some estimates suggest that the Russians and the Ukrainians have each suffered at least 100,000 casualties so far, meaning both killed and wounded. Such extreme losses in personnel and material have not been seen in Europe since World War II or perhaps even World War One. Now, to be certain, the Ukrainians would not have been able to survive the initial onslaught and then push back to the Russian invaders without many billions of dollars of American and NATO military and other assistance. The war in Ukraine has proven to be a bonanza for American arms manufacturers. The war in Ukraine does have great meaning, both symbolic and real, as the front line in a much larger global struggle between the Western democratic project and the autocracy and neo-fascism embodied by Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Jair Bolsonaro, and Erdogan, Narendra Modi, and or Modi, or whatever the fuck you want to call them, and the Trumpists and repugs at large, and the larger white right in the United States. Basically, they're the only ones against the Ukrainian war. I mean, against the Ukraine thing. Now, the war in Ukraine is a site for grand power politics as well. Russia's place in the world is greatly diminished, as it is now a second-tier power with nuclear weapons. China is boldly inserting itself in the European politics by choosing to either supply Russia with lethal aid and or brokering a peace deal. Iran is asserting itself as well by supplying Russia with drones that are being used to terrorize the Ukrainians. The U.S. and NATO have strengthened their already very deep ties even more, and the alliance is rejuvenated and is now again viewed as indispensable to the West's security against Russia. And what remains of the hopes and dreams of a permanent democratic order? The war in Ukraine has forced a recalibration there as well. The end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union was supposed to usher in a Pax Americana and a new order where the Western style of democracy and stability were uncontested around the world, especially in Europe. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and that growing catastrophe is a reminder once again of just how much that dream remains unfulfilled. As the first year of the war in Ukraine becomes the second year, the Russians are preparing for a new offensive in the spring. The Russian army is attempting to replenish itself with hundreds of thousands of conscripts, and Putin shows no sign of stopping his belligerence. Now he views the war in Ukraine as a generational struggle and existential battle for Russia and his legacy against the West as a whole. Now, Vladimir Putin continues to threaten the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and elsewhere if he deems it necessary to defend the motherland against the United States and NATO. Now, the Ukrainians are also preparing a counteroffensive as they integrate the new Western equipment into their military. The question for the Ukrainian leadership is now how much more of the homeland can be liberated. Now, in an effort to better understand this complex and its often confusing nature of the war in Ukraine and its broader implications, basically, Chauncey de Vega spoke with Elliot Ackerman. Basically, Elliot Ackerman is a New York Times best-selling author of several different books, including 2034, a novel of the next World War, the fifth act of America's End in Afghanistan, and Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. Ackerman is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a Marine veteran, having served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, and where he received the Silver Star and the Bronze Star for Valor and the Purple Heart. In this wide-ranging conversation, Ackerman reflects on the different competing narratives and agendas and even versions of history and reality that are being applied to the war in Ukraine. Ackerman summarizes some of what we know now about the war in Ukraine 1 year later, and why so many preliminary expectations and predictions proved to be incorrect. He also highlights the lessons that Western and other militaries are learning from the war, and Ackerman warns that peace through strength should be the guiding rule for how America and its allies confront such countries as Russia and Iran and other malign actors. At the end of this conversation, he highlights how history demonstrates that Russia is far from being defeated, and they will learn and adapt, and that peace or victory, whatever that means in this context, will likely not come to Ukraine anytime soon. Basically, there has been a unique perspective on the war in Ukraine. Basically, Ackerman is a decorated combat veteran, and basically he's written excellent, well-researched, and properly sourced military speculative fiction, such as the novel 2034. And basically, he has a deep knowledge of policy and the operational art of war. And given all those lenses, how was he able to see and make sense of the war in Ukraine? Now, in many ways, he's like everyone else. Basically, we're trying to process it. We're trying to understand the competing narratives that exist about the war in Ukraine. Now, the stories that America is telling itself about the war 1 year later, what about the Ukrainian experience? What story are the Russians telling about the war? Ultimately, everyone is telling different stories about what this war is about and what the stakes are. I don't think that's unique at all to the war in Ukraine, but it's a future of war more generally. And the reason that we fight wars is because we can't agree on what the war is about in the first place. The Ukrainians and Russians both have certain strategic strengths that they're bringing into the conflict. Now, conversely, they both have weaknesses. Now, one of the obvious Ukrainian strengths is that they are fighting for their homeland. The war is completely existential for them. The Russians have a strength in that they are fighting a war in somebody else's home, so the society isn't the one that's ravaged. The Russians also have the advantage of raw human resources and sheer numbers, and they believe that they can outlast the Ukrainians and the world more generally. The world will get tired of being involved in Ukraine and domestic politics, and it will change in the U.S. and Western Europe. And this is what the Russians and Vladimir Putin, the dictator, are hoping for. It's been 1 year since this war. And what does the anniversary mean in that context? It would be fascinating to see if we went back and looked at media clippings during the First World War to see if the reporters and journalists in August of 1915 were writing their obligatory 1 year anniversary pieces. Anniversaries signal the institutionalization or codification of something that's happened. But that being said, the event is going to extend into the future. Obviously, if you're fighting a war, you don't want a second or third or fourth anniversary. You want it to fucking end. Is commemoration a better word than anniversary? It is appropriate to be marking wars down in time. Is time the metric by which we should be talking about a war? Okay, so you have to understand a 1 year anniversary. What do you do for the second year anniversary? Tell me. It would seem as though the energy would be better spent if we're focusing on the objectives of the war in Ukraine. In the Second World War, people knew the tasks that needed to be accomplished. The Allies knew that we needed to take back Europe. We knew that we needed to invade France. The Russians knew that they needed to push the Germans out of Poland. But we seem more fixated on just marking the war in Ukraine, time progression, as opposed to the progression of objectives that would lead to the end of the war. And I agree. I find the continual marking of anniversaries of wars that exist in our life to be a little misguided sometimes. Okay, even like I said, even though it's 1 year later, what do we know now that we didn't know last year? The big thing we did not know was how strong the we didn't know how strong the Ukrainian resistance would be. The common belief was that the Ukrainians would be overwhelmed by this Russian military juggernaut. We also did not know that the Russian military had such an extent. Basically, the Russian military in Ukraine is not the force that we faced during the Cold War. The Russian military is underperforming. The Ukrainian military is overperforming. I would also add that NATO is doing way better than I would have anticipated. It is strong, and we have to remember that back in February of 2022, less than 6 months after August of 2021, where we see the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is also a NATO withdrawal from that country. I would also argue that was probably one of, if not NATO's darkest hour and most severe humiliation that they endured. The fact that you see this massive NATO underperformance in Afghanistan promptly followed by NATO overperformance is something I don't think a lot of people expected, including Vladimir Putin, the Russian dictator. Now, international events are moving very, very quickly right now. It's tough to keep up and understand exactly where we're at on any type of timeline with regard to these wars and the realignments that are going on around the world. Now, are we closer to the end of the war in Ukraine, or is this just the beginning? Now, for me, I felt for a while that we're living in the time before. I wouldn't even say that we're at the end of the beginning, but we're at the middle of the beginning. Too often discussions about these individual wars are taking place in a vacuum. Ukraine does not exist in a vacuum. There is a realignment that's going on right now, and we no longer currently live in the post-Cold War era, and we most certainly do not live in the post-9/11 era anymore either. But I don't think we really know what era that we are in now in terms of global politics. Now there are rising authoritarian nations that are challenging the Western democratic world order as led by the United States. I do not believe that we know what this global realignment will look like once it settles down. Now here's a basic fucking question. Why does Ukraine fucking matter? Ukraine matters because having one nation invade another unprovoked, especially in a key strategic region of the world, is unacceptable. Another reason Ukraine matters is because if it had fallen quickly to the Russians, that would have signaled other countries within similar aggressive designs on their neighbors. But China learned the lesson that now is the time to take a move on Taiwan. Such an outcome would have made for a very different world than the one that we are currently occupying. Now, returning to my point about anniversaries, in some ways, the silos that conflict and make it seem as though its own standalone set of challenges, we need to see the war in Ukraine in a global context. The Russian military of 2021 is obviously not the Soviet military at the height of the Cold War, but it was a real force to be reckoned with. There's a lot of ground that's been covered since 1991, and when the Cold War ends, the United States is economically dominant. The U.S. has a conventional military that is unmatched by any other country in the world strategically. The U.S. invests more substantially in our conventional military, such as state-of-the-art aircraft, tanks, and ships of the line. The U.S. maintains, but does not meaningfully expand our investment in our nuclear arsenal. After the fall of the Soviet Union, and a significant weakening of Russia, their ability to maintain and compete with the U.S. tank for tank or ship for ship just evaporates. The Russians cannot compete economically. The Russians know that they can maintain their nuclear arsenal, but in many ways we're seeing the result of that in Ukraine with Putin's nuclear saber rattling. The Russian military doctrine right now embraces a strategy called escalate to de-escalate. In the Ukraine context, that would mean probably using a low-grade tactical nuclear weapon, something that would take out a base and kill a few thousand people. That would not change the strategic balance by itself, but using a nuclear weapon is a way to change the nature of the conflict. The goal for the Russians being to make the U.S. and NATO pause and perhaps want to renegotiate or de-escalate the situation. Now, using a nuclear weapon in such a way actually makes sense. If the Russians did such a thing, it would upend the world order and create a new age of world events by shattering a long-standing taboo. The new world would be marked by everything that happened before the Russians used a nuke and everything that happened afterward. Now, what are the stories that we're telling ourselves about this war? And now, for instance, if you listen to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, he's basically saying that the war in Ukraine is a battlefield and a broader world war. And that world war is about what the global system will look like going forward and whether or not it will be dominated, at least in part by these authoritarian nations like Iran or Russia or China. That's one narrative of the war. Another narrative of the war is what we are seeing from Republicans. However disingenuously, complaining that Biden is in Ukraine and we have problems here at home. Putin's versions of events is that Ukraine and Russia are, generally speaking, one people and that Ukraine should not even exist independently of Russia proper. I don't know where we are at this timeline. I just know that there are lots of different people putting out competing narratives that are attended by violence to try to win this argument. Now, to paraphrase another dictator years ago, Joseph Stalin, one dead person is a tragedy. A million people is a statistic. Now, at a certain point, these numbers start to become meaningless because the human mind can't comprehend that much suffering. Basically, I'm not a Russian and I'm not a Ukrainian, but I would imagine at a certain point that you might read a news story or see a statistic and your mind cannot comprehend what it means. Your mind truly cannot process that you would potentially be folded into these huge numbers. Now, if you're in combat, you can only control the narrow and relatively narrowing set of decisions in front of you, which is managing your little slice of the war and trying to do your job and trying to survive it. We have not seen a war fought like this in Europe with casualty numbers even approaching these levels in many decades. Now, we often don't do enough to evaluate the intangible factors that determine the outcomes of a battle or war. Such losses obviously will make it very difficult for the Russians to sustain the war, but the Ukrainians will have a difficult time sustaining high casualties because they have a smaller comparative population. If we look to history as a guide, the cold clinical statistics often are not what decides the war. War is a distinctively human enterprise. As Clausewitz tells us, war is politics by other means. If you ever lose sight of the political and focus too clinically on the statistic, and trying to understand the outcome of a war, you're going to get an outcome that surprises you. For every example of the People's War that is ultimately successful against an invading army, for example, like the Vietnam War, there are other examples where a very motivated force is ultimately just outgunned and they cannot sustain their war. I would not try to predict the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but I think that's a loser's game. We need to watch and reach for as many historical examples and touchpoints that we have to keep ourselves informed and to see the bigger picture. Now, as we enter the warmer weather in Ukraine during the spring and summer, these are going to be their critical months. Now, war is ever changing and it's also timeless because you never know when it's going to end. We are seeing both new lessons and also things that need to just be relearned. Early on in the war, we saw the incredible efficacy of anti-platform systems. Russian tanks were being blown into flaming coffins by javelin missiles and the end laws by small groups of Ukrainians. The Russian capital ship, the Moskva, was sunk in the Black Sea by a Neptune anti-ship missile. As we look to the future of warfare, especially to the Pacific with China, these anti-platform systems are very effective. That reality should cause American defense planners to pause and ask themselves if we should be putting so many resources into large platforms like aircraft carriers and destroyers and very expensive tanks when the anti-platform systems are incredibly effective. Now, with that being said, and that we are seeing in the east of Ukraine is that the war there is a throwback. It is low tech. There is a trench warfare. It's artillery heavy and grinding, and there's a lot of movement in all the war in Ukraine. And in all, the war in Ukraine runs the spectrum from the high tech anti platform systems to use of cheap drones that are used to spot for artillery and mortars. It is a hybrid type of war, and then we're also seeing a type of low tech war that closely resembles World War I on the Western Front. Now we know these things. But these lessons. Okay, so a war with China, for example, would require massive expenditures of weaponry. Ukraine is testing the U.S. and NATO's stockpiles and armaments industry. Now, America's economy would have to be totally reoriented, and these are old lessons going back to World War One. Now we know these things. Those lessons were forgotten or perhaps just not taken seriously enough. If the United States ever fights a war against a peer-level nation like China, or an alliance between China and Iran where they battle against the NATO allies, that will mean the mobilization of the entire nation. That is not because of casualties, but because we would need every person in the country working to support the war because it is so resource intensive. There's a reason that America shut down from 1941 to 45, and everybody put on the uniform and had to work to win the war. We're seeing little shades of that in Ukraine in a way that most of us have not seen in our lifetime. Even with the huge defense budgets of the Cold War, it was not a hot war, but a hungry war that had to be fed. Now, between the war in Ukraine and the type of social and the type of societal disruption we experience at home here in the U.S. during the pandemic, if we were to blend those two together, that could approximate what could be potentially be like to fight China or another pure nation. Now, having the system isn't enough, but you need to integrate these weapons and weapon systems into some type of battle plan that will be effective. Is a battalion of Abrams tanks going to be used as a spearhead of an offensive? And just because somebody hands you a hammer doesn't mean you can build a house. But if you have the right plan, you can maybe start putting nails, and make that you can start putting in some nails and making a little bit of progress here and there. Psychologically, I think it would be surreal for Americans to see our equipment engaged against Russian troops, and we're going to learn a lot about how that equipment performs against that type of near-pure conventional force. Now, our equipment comes from all types of countries, but it is all standardized to NATO requirements. One of the challenges in Ukraine right now is that they have a lot of Soviet equipment, so yes, it'll be a challenge to integrate all the equipment logistically. The one advantage that we have in Ukraine is that there is a massive border between Ukraine and Poland. The supplies can go overland. The Ukrainians basically hold 2/3 of the country in the west, which means that getting things to the front can be much more fraught than it is. Now, there is a process of training and integration that's going to have to take place, and it takes a while, but you just need to start it and get it going. There was no real shortcut here. We would have been farther along in the process of effectively arming Ukraine with these new weapon systems that the U.S. and NATO and other allies had started in April or May. And when it comes to actors such as Russia or Iran, that weakness is a very real provocation. Peace through strength is a pretty much wise dictum in that part of the world, and I think we're starting to show some strength. but I think it probably would have been better off if we had shown it about 9 months ago. Now, with Russia, they are adapting. And how are they? Well, actually, I don't know if you would call it adapting, but how are they adapting? The Russians thought the Ukrainian defenses would just collapse. Clearly, that didn't happen. Their invasion did not go as planned. But when you look at Russia's wars and the ones that they have fought, they have a narrative that goes back to the Napoleonic Wars. In World War II, the Russians called the Great Patriotic War. We see the same narrative where they are attacked by Western powers. Certainly, it doesn't go well. And there's a period of sort of retreat or a period of setback, and the Russian bear awakens, counterattacks, and then the marches go, and then they march on to glory. So even as we see this Russian disaster in Ukraine over a year later, the Russians are now creating a narrative where they are regrouping, mobilizing the nation, and counterattacking. The expectations that the Russians are crushed in terms of morale and about to collapse is one that I wouldn't necessarily take that for granted. If China closely allies with Russia, how will this impact the outcome of the war in Ukraine? An alliance where the Chinese are providing lethal aid to Russia will most certainly not be a good thing for Ukraine. It would be bad for the West as well, whether or not China is willing to go through with that and ally itself with Russia, which at this point is really a pariah state. I don't know that the Chinese would do it, but we can end up being wrong. But I believe that China's leaders are more savvy than this. Now, what does a victory mean for Ukraine, and what would a victory mean for Russia either? A victory for Ukraine is in some ways going to be challenging because victory is predicated on the idea that you've demonstrated a certain degree of battlefield success. Therefore, if the Ukrainians are demonstrating that battlefield success, it becomes difficult for them to start negotiating in the way where they're going to give up pieces of land to Russia. Is victory a Russian withdrawal back to the pre-February 24th borders? And if so, that means that Ukraine would accept losing Crimea, and there are probably some Ukrainians who won't accept the idea that Crimea is Russian. Is it realistic to believe that Ukraine can get back everything before February 24th and Crimea? There would have to be some significant Russian setbacks for this to happen. Now, victory is very much of a function of psychology. What does victory mean for Russia, and what is the amount of territory that they're going to have to take from Ukraine before they can say that they have a victory? And sure, if Russia invades all of Ukraine and Ukraine ceases to exist, that would be a victory. But it's not realistic. The Russians would be facing a massive counterinsurgency inside of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians and Russians are fighting and trying to achieve whatever success they can on the battlefield. And once they feel like they have gotten everything that they can on the battlefield, that might be the moment when serious negotiations will begin. But right now, each side believes it has more to gain by fighting than by trying to negotiate, so they're just going to keep on fighting the war and see who wins it. So if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. Also, you can also hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when a new video comes out. You could also leave a comment, let me know what you think. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a video or a month, your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.